Hello, and the purpose of this video is to cover sort of like the history of the anti-Trinitarian movement, and also the history of Arius Christology. And you know, I am a committed anti-Trinitarian, and I am committed to the Christology of Arius, right? I reject the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople. I want to go back in time, like, because you know, the anti-Trinitarian movement does not start with the 19th century Restoration. Okay, a lot of people have a misconception that Jehovah's Witnesses are like the initiators of the anti-Trinitarian, and you know, of the anti-Trinitarian idea, and that, you know, it is Jehovah's Witnesses who say, only Jehovah's Witnesses say that, you know, Jesus is not God or whatever. You know, actually, you know, Jehovah's Witnesses are a sort of modern expression of anti-Trinitarianism, and a modern expression of a modified version of Arius Christology. Okay, Arius Christology goes all the way back to the, you know, all the way back to the beginning of you know, before the Catholic Church. So you know, so the Jehovah's Witnesses did not start the anti-Trinitarian movement. Okay, anti-Trinitarianism has existed for hundreds of years. It has been mostly underground, but has come up. Arianism was suppressed, physically suppressed in the, you know, Eastern Roman Empire. It emerged again, you know, around the time of the Radical Reformation with Michael Servetus, and you know, and again it went underground again, and then it reemerged again, you know, in context of, you know, the Bible student movement, which is a subset of North American Restorationist Christian primitivism. Charles A. Russell. So from Arius to Servetus to Russell, there is a continuity here that never, you know, never went away. Now, the Jehovah's Witnesses is split from the Bible student movement started by Charles A. Russell in 1931, but they took with them, you know, the anti-Trinitarian and, you know, Arius Christology with them. You know, they took that with them. You know, so it's okay. You know, and you know, they came up with this pamphlet. The pamphlet, you know, Should You Believe in the Trinity, right? And I continue to use this pamphlet. This pamphlet is a very good pamphlet. It is the Jehovah's Witnesses contribution to the anti-Trinitarian, you know, tradition, whatever, is good. I mean, it, obviously, you know, it is, you know, tweaked to fit Jehovah's Witness theology, right? But a lot of what this pamphlet says, you know, minus, you know, the quirks or whatever associated with Jehovah's Witness theology, and you got to be able to, you know, discern and whatever. But in general, this is a very good pamphlet. You can get it for free, you know, from the I think you can download it from jw.org, or definitely you can get it, you know, in the JW Library app, which you can get for free from, you know, Google Play. I still have, you know, the Jehovah's Witness app. You know, I have it on my phone. You know, I still have it. You know, but now I have the Mormon app, right? But I still keep the Jehovah's Witness app because there's good things in it. There's good things there's books. They have all the books and everything. I have a bunch of books that I downloaded and stuff. So yeah, and one of the things that I have is this pamphlet in English and Swedish. I have this pamphlet in the app in English, Swedish, and Spanish, right? But in physical, I have the Spanish, but because whatever. But it's the same, you know. But yeah, so I'm going to be referring to this this pamphlet in context of discussing, you know, the issue of the Trinity. I am also going to be referring to the book. In this video, I'm going to be referring to anti-Trinitarianism and Arius Christology, right? I'm also going to be referring to the Jehovah's Witness book, Mankind's Search for God, and this is a really, really good Jehovah's Witness book. You can also get it from the, you know, the JW Library app, or from the, I don't know if you can get it from JW.org, certainly from the app you can get it. In the app you can get the app for free from Google Play. So yeah, JW Library is called. I still have it, like I said, in my phone. I have it, and I keep updating it. I download it. I have all the books and everything, videos, everything. You know, I keep up. There's good information in it. But the chapter I'm interested in is chapter 11, apostasy, right? Discussing the apostasy, right? So, and again, when you read this book, you got to read, you know, with, you know, whatever, because with discernment, because it is tweaked to fit Jehovah's Witness theology. So you can, when you read this material from Jehovah's Witnesses, is good material. When you want to, you know, look at the issue of the Trinity and Arius Christology, By all means refer to them, but make sure you do it, critically. Don't just, yeah. And anyways, for a more objective view, I'm going to be referring to this book, Byzantium, the Early Centuries, right, by John Julius Norwich. And John Julius Norwich, of course, he wrote 3 volumes on the history of the Byzantine Empire, and I've read 2 of them. I've read this one, Early Centuries, and the last one, The Decline and Fall. And I haven't read the middle one, the Apogee. I haven't read it. I haven't got it to read it. I have it, but I haven't read it. And anyways, this book, The Early Centuries, really, because this book, if you look at the table of contents, it starts with Constantine and it ends pretty much with Heraclius, right? And Heraclius is the one who had to deal with the rise of Islam. So, I am not a professional Byzantine historian or whatever. I'm not a professional historian of Roman history, but for reading the material that John Julius Norwich has put together in his books, from studying these books, I would posit the hypothesis that, the East Roman Empire is one thing and the Byzantine entity is another. Okay, and I would say that from Constantine to Heraclius, you have the Eastern Roman Empire proper. And, from Constantine to Heraclius, you have in between, you have Julian, Flavius Claudius Julianus, you have, Justinian, the Emperor Justinian, of course, and his general Belisarius, and then Heraclius. You have the tyranny of Pocas, who was like about the same as Caligula or Nero. So those people would be the Eastern Roman Empire. Right, so the whole history of, the beginnings of Anti-Trinitarianism and Arius Christology, the cauldron for that, the context for that is this East Roman Empire, right? And the reason I say that the Byzantine entity is something different, because, Islam, pretty much changed everything. Islam conquered Syria, Islam conquered Palestine, Islam conquered North Africa, inclusive Egypt. When the East Roman Empire lost Egypt, that was the end of the East Roman Empire, because Egypt was its most important economic subset. So once Egypt went Muslim, that was it, pretty much. You could the economy of what became then the Byzantines was completely different. And then, sort of like, and yeah, in the East Roman Empire, Latin coexisted with Greek, but after, Greek sort of like took over, it became more a Greek entity as opposed to like a Roman, really, so, you know what I mean? So that's my hypothesis, that, after, let's say, when was the Heraclius went up, the Heraclian line here ends about 685 AD, so let's say from Constantine to 685 AD, maybe you can have the Eastern Roman Empire, and yeah, so the context for the Anti-Trinitarianism, the context for, Arius Christology is that. So, I just wanted to contextualize that. And again, I'm going to put a link in the description to where you can buy these books. I'm sure you can get them still, because they're classic. These books are, authoritative, definitive. It is the source for, if you want to know the history of the Eastern Roman Empire / Byzantium, these are the 3 books that you look at. And he also wrote a summary of all 3 books. And also he also wrote a history of Venice. So it's interesting. I haven't gotten into his history of Venice yet, because I'm not really, Venice is an interesting idea, interesting topic, but I'm not really that interested in Venice. I'm more interested in the Roman Empire. So, yeah, but, anyhow, like I mentioned, the 3 main exponents of Anti-Trinitarianism, and, the idea that the Father is greater than the Son. The 3 main exponents of Anti-Trinitarianism. Okay, I'm going to give you this. Arius of Alexandria, condemned at the Council of Nicaea as a heretic in 325 AD, and his doctrines were, in summary, that Jesus was the Son of God, but not of the same divine substance as the Father, homo ousios, that Jesus was subordinate to the Father is greater than the Son, that Jesus was a perfect man but not divine, and that Jesus was created by the Father. Right? So that's Arius. That's the essence of Arianism, of the Arian Christology, right? The Arian movement. And then you have Michael Servetus, who surfaced in the time of the Radical Reformation, martyred in 1553 for his rejection of the doctrine of the Trinity and his opposition to infant baptism. He published in 1531 the book De Trinitatis Erroibus. Servetus formulated a version of Savelianism, a moralistic monarchianism, which held that Christ and the Holy Spirit are merely representative forms of the one Godhead, the Father, one person with three. He still believed in it, but it was one person with three aspects. But yeah, it was moralistic monarchianism, right? So, for example, in this system, I mean, the Father is one, but he can manifest himself as Holy Spirit or Christ as the situation calls for. So it's like a Godhead that expresses itself as one of these three persons, but only as that in a specific circumstances, and sort of like switches back and forth or whatever. It's an interesting concept, you know. I mean, I'm not into Savelianism, you know. I'm not into it. I believe God is one, and that's it. Okay, he's one, and that's that. And Jesus and the Holy Spirit are separate entities. And I want to go through the issue of the Christological spectrum. And in many videos in this channel, I have talked about the Christological spectrum, and I have sort of like used colloquial terms to define the Christological spectrum. In the epistemological, in the second season epistemological statement of this channel, I say that, you know, the most important theological question is what is the nature of Jesus Christ, right? But when I talked about it, I used the colloquial terms for the different positions, you know, and like not just the colloquial terms, but also the positions that survived. And, you know, that would be Docetic, you know, Arian, Nicene Constantinopolitan, you know, and Arian, you know, let's see, Docetic, Nicene Constantinopolitan, Arian, and Nestorian, right? And if you want to add Islam, you could add it. And also you got to pay attention to what the Judeo-Christians were saying about Jesus, right? And the Ebionites who evolved out of the Judeo-Christians, because in the first century there were two congregations. There was the Apostolic congregation and there was the Judeo-Christians, and the Judeo-Christians evolved into the Ebionites, and they have their own Christology. And then Islam, of course, came up with their own Christology, you know, and now lately, you know, the Mormons have their own Christology, you know. So yeah, there's all sorts of positions with the Christological spectrum as it stands today. However, the technical terms for the Christological spectrum is what I'm going to talk about now. Okay, and these are the technical terms. Okay, the Christological spectrum, different versions of Jesus, right? So choose your version. Hypostases, coexisting natures. Monophysitism, only one nature divine. Miaphysitism, two natures united as one. Nestorianism, two separate natures. Arianism, only a perfect human nature. Evionism, ordinary mortal. Docetism, a spiritual being appearing to be human. Okay, so those are the technical terms. That is the technical Christological spectrum. And I mean, some of these positions did not survive and are irrelevant, but some did. So yeah. Anyways, I just wanted to touch on that, the Christological spectrum. Yeah, and Jehovah's Witnesses are, of course, Arian. Is greater than the Son, right? Okay. In the old Teach book, Jehovah's Witnesses say that the Father is greater than the Son, right? But they don't cite Arius. See, if you read the Teach book, the part that it talks about Christology, you get the impression that it is Jehovah's Witnesses who came up with the idea that Jesus is not God. And this is something Jehovah's Witnesses do. They pretend that they came up with that idea. And when you mention the issue of, Arius is the one who came up with the idea along several hundred years ago, you know, they get angry. And one of the reasons I got in trouble with the elders is because I had that conversation with the person studying the Bible with me. And he went to the elders and told them that I was being heretical or whatever. You know, because if you mention Arius in the Jehovah's Witnesses, you're a heretic, right? Because you're not supposed to mention Arius, because according to Jehovah's Witnesses, they are the ones who came up with anti-Trinitarianism, or the doctrine that Jesus is not God or whatever, which is lies. It's not true. I mean, in their publications, they have covered. I saw an article about Michael Servetus. On the anti-Trinitarian issue, they do cover people from the radical Reformation, like Michael Servetus. They do. But on the Christological issue, on the Arian Christology issue, they completely ignore Arius. Arius, as far as Jehovah's Witnesses are concerned, Arius never existed. You know, so that's one problem I have with them. You know, and when they do mention Arius, they try to distance themselves from him, saying that, well, his theology was not the same as ours. True, the details are different. However, you do quote Arius' slogan, "The Father is greater than the Son." And I'm gonna point out to something here in the John Julius Norwich book, so that you can see what I'm talking about. In the chapter that is called "Of Heresies and Huns," the chapter called "Of Heresies and Huns," right? In this chapter, which covers the period between 410 and 453, there is a quote from Saint Gregory of Nyssa that he quotes. And Saint Gregory of Nyssa said, quote, "If you ask a man for change, he will give you a piece of philosophy concerning the begotten and the unbegotten. If you inquire the price of a loaf, he replies, the Father is greater than the Son, and the Son inferior. Or if you ask whether the bath is ready, the answer you receive is that the Son was made out of nothing." So, you know, that points out that at the time, at least between 410 and 453, you know, the ideas of Arius were being discussed and were very popular in the general population, right? The issue of what was the nature of Jesus was a hot issue in the streets, right? And Arius controlled the streets. You know, the bishops, the official bishops, the Niceno-Constantinopolitan bishops control the church, but Arius controls the followers of Arius, successors of Arius, control the streets. Anti-Trinitarianism ran the streets. You know, the popular church was anti-Trinitarian. The popular church was followed the Christology of Arius. So, you know what I mean? So, and that's something that, you know, the Christians don't like to dwell on or whatever. You know, but whatever. Yeah. So, yeah. So Jehovah's Witnesses, as you can see from that quote from St. Gregory of Nyssa, Jehovah's Witnesses did not invent the idea of Arius Christology. However, their pamphlet is very useful, right? So let's go over some issues here about the Council of Nicaea, right? Before I get into the Council of Nicaea, let's get into what, you know, I quote from the Jehovah's Witness pamphlet. What were the teachings of the primitive Christians when it comes to the issue of the Trinity, right? And they quote the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology. Primitive Christianity did not have a Trinitarian doctrine, an explicit Trinitarian doctrine, like the one that was elaborated afterwards in the Creed. Okay. Primitive Christianity did not have an explicit Trinitarian doctrine. Okay. However, you know, at the beginning, the primitive Christians did not think of applying that idea of the Trinity to their faith. You know, so they never really thought about it. I mean, their devotions were dedicated to God the Father and Jesus, the Son of God, and they recognized the Holy Spirit, but there was no idea that these three beings were, you know, conformed together in a Trinity, where they are, you know, consubstantial and united as one. That idea was not present in the first century congregation. So this consubstantiality stuff was not present in the first century congregation. And this is a quote from a book called The Paganism in Our Christianity, right? At first, the Christian faith was not Trinitarian, okay? It was not also in the apostolic and sub-apostolic era, like it is reflected in the New Testament and in other writings of primitive Christians, okay? Yeah, so that's what the primitive Christians it is pretty much established. And you know, scholars will tell you this, the biblical scholars will tell you this, that, you know, and the honest ones who are not engaging in apologetics, you know, the like legitimate Bible historians, legitimate, you know, historians of Christianity that are not engaged in apologetics, they will tell you the honest truth that the first century congregation, the first century apostolic congregation, did not believe in the doctrine of the Trinity. The first century apostolic congregation did not believe that Jesus is God. Okay. Anyways, yeah, and again, yeah, and now the Jehovah's Witnesses have a theory here as to about how does the doctrine of the Trinity was developed, and he said many believe that it was formulated at the Council of Nicaea in 325 EC, right? But that is not totally correct. Yeah, right. The Trinity, they argue, no, the Trinity doctrine was not established at that. The Jehovah's Witnesses argue that the Trinity doctrine was not established at that council because the doctrine did not include the issue of the Holy Spirit. It only said that the Father and Son were consubstantial. But, you know, yeah, technically that's true. You know, the Council of Nicaea did not say the Holy Spirit is consubstantial too. It left the Holy Spirit out of the question. But, I mean, it established the premise of consubstantiality, which was the framework for the invention of then the incorporation of the three beings into this Trinity later on. The Holy Spirit got incorporated into the arrangement with the Father and Son, and the consubstantiality was extended to the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit became a person. All that was developed later, right? So, but the premise of it though was this consubstantiality stuff. And let's see, in the book Mankind's Search for God, which is also published by Jehovah's Witnesses, this one, it says, you know, is a very interesting quote here by a biblical scholar, historian Will Durant explains, quote, "The church took over some religious customs and forms common in pre-Christian pagan Rome. The stole and other vestments of pagan priests, the use of incense and holy water in purifications, the burning of candles and an everlasting light before the altar, the worship of the saints, the architecture of the basilica, the law of Rome as basis for canon law, the title of Pontifex Maximus for the supreme pontiff, and in the 4th century, the Latin language. Soon the bishops, rather than the Roman prefects, would be the source of order and the seat of power in the cities. The metropolitans or archbishops would support, if not supplant, the provincial governors, and the synod of the bishops would succeed the provincial assembly. The Roman Church followed in the footsteps of the Roman state." And he wrote this in the History of Civilization, Part 3, Caesar and Christ. So, you know, this is just to provide a context for the process that took place, you know, after the establishment of this Niceno-Constantinopolitan doctrine. Basically, you know, you have the emergence of the Catholic Church as, you know, the religious subset of the Roman state, and then, you know, the progressive, you know, takeover of certain roles that became political, right? Political roles. They became, and ultimately in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church in Western Europe became the state, right? The supra state, sort of like the replacement for the emperor. And yeah, they did crown, you know, Charles the Great, you know, on December 24th, 800, they crowned Charles the Great and established the Holy Roman Empire. You know, they restored an emperor and what have you. But even in that system, with the emperor present, the church wielded a lot of power, you know, because they had the right of investiture, etc. So, you know, the emperor had power, but the church, you know, wasn't exactly, you know, subordinate to him. And you can see this, for example, in Carlos V. Carlos V was, you know, the most powerful of the Holy Roman emperors there. You know, Carlos V was an emperor, you know, a real emperor. I mean, he ran, you know, El Imperio Español, and he had, you know, sections of Germany, the Netherlands, the Americas. I mean, it was a huge empire, you know. He was emperor, but, you know, the church, you know, was, you know, the church had a lot of power and influence in his court. You know what I mean? So, yeah. But yeah, anyways, let's go now to the Council of Nicaea, the issue. And now I'm going to consult, you know, the history book, right? I'm going to get out of the Jehovah's Witnesses for now. Let's see, first about Constantine the Great. And Constantine the Great, right? Yeah, and the reason they say he's the great. Okay, I'm gonna be fair with Constantine here. And the whole thing that when people defend Constantine, they say, well, if it wasn't for the Edict of Milan ended the persecutions. Yeah, the Edict of Milan, right? So let's look at this Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan was the February 1313 AD agreement to treat Christians benevolently within the Roman Empire. Western Roman Emperor Constantine I and the Emperor Licinius, who controlled the Balkans, met in Mediolanum, modern-day Milan, and among other things, agreed to change policies towards Christians. Following the Edict of Toleration issued by Emperor Galerius 2 years earlier in Serdica. The Edict of Milan gave Christianity legal status and a reprieve from persecution, but did not make it the state church of the Roman Empire. That occurred in 380 with the Edict of Thessalonica. Okay, so yeah. Okay, the Edict of Milan. Look, for what I read, the Edict of Milan was not just about Christianity. The Edict of Milan, the Edict of Milan was really about religious toleration in general. And Christians were included in that religious toleration, but they weren't the only group. There were other religions or whatever that were included in that number. So it wasn't just the Christians who benefited from the Edict of Milan. Okay, and again, I point out the issue, which is a factual thing, that Constantine was a pagan. Constantine baptized in his deathbed. Okay, Constantine, when he took over and ran the Council of Nicaea, he was a pagan. So this theology that he formulated, that consubstantiality, came from a pagan, okay, a pagan emperor, Constantine. Okay, he was not a Christian when he formulated this theology. And there is something else in the Jehovah's Witness pamphlet, which is interesting to look at, which we need to look at really quick. And here is in the pamphlet there is a picture of the Council of Nicaea, right? Council of Nicaea. There is Constantine, right? Obviously, this representation is probably from a lot later, but yeah, like there is Constantine right here, and it says here, basically, Constantine did not understand anything of the questions that were made about Greek theology. Okay, Constantine had no clue what these bishops were discussing because he was a pagan. He didn't, basically, this doctrine of consubstantiality is something he came up with. I don't know where he got it from. Probably some pagan source. I don't know. I don't know. Perhaps somebody else that he was in touch with that told him this, an advisor, I don't know, whatever. But clearly Constantine, didn't have a clue as to what's being discussed. So and that quote is from A Short History of Christian Doctrine, right? And again, it's quoted in the Jehovah's Witness pamphlet. So about the Trinity. So whatever, So and let's see, Constantine. Let's look back at Constantine the Great or whatever. Constantine the Great, right? Because we're supposed to believe he's great because of the Edict of Milan, whatever. Yeah, it depends on who you talk to. Okay, this is what is said. This is actually Constantine the Great. Constantine, in his own words, quoted by Eusebius, right? Who wrote the life of Constantine, right? This is what Constantine had to say about himself, and you can tell about his words speak volumes. With such impiety pervading the human race, and the state threatened with destruction, what relief did God devise? I myself was the instrument He chose. Thus, beginning at the remote ocean of Britain, where the sun sinks beneath the horizon in obedience to the law of nature, with God's help, I banished and eliminated every form of evil then prevailing, in the hope that the human race, enlightened through me, might be recalled to a proper observance of God's holy laws. Okay? You know what I mean? I myself was the instrument He chose, enlightened through me. He was a total megalomaniac, He was a megalomaniac, like enlightened through me, that God chose me or whatever. Yeah, whatever. Apparently, the God of Jesus, the Father of Jesus, chose him. like he's an apostle, or, like this is like, right, like I guess he's alluding to like what happened to Paul on the road to, whatever, Damascus or what have you, I don't know, maybe he thought of himself that way, that he was some sort of, Paul 2.0 or what have you, whatever, because he saw, like, he claims to have seen the sign of the PX in the sky during the Battle of the Milvian Bridge or what have you, whatever. Yeah. Anyways, Constantine thought of himself as some sort of, the new Paul or what have you, and on that basis, even though he was a pagan who baptized in his deathbed, and on that basis he came up with this theology of the and let's look at the Council of Nicaea, the what happened, because again, Norwich talks about that in the chapter called the adoption of the faith, which is the second. Like, let's see, Nicaea too boasted an imperial palace, and it was here that the Great Council was held between 20th May and 19 June 325. Despite the emperor's hopes for a large attendance from the Western churches, these were poorly represented. The controversy was of little interest to them. Apart from Bishop Hosius, there were only the bishops of Calabria and Carthage, two others respectively from Gaul and Ilidia, and a couple of priests, sent from Rome, more as observers than anything else, by Pope Sylvester. The Western Catholic Church was not interested in this. And it's interesting because the Catholic Church today is like the militant advocate of consubstantiality and Trinitarianism and Jesus is God, whatever. And, when the council happened, they weren't interested. So, I don't know, whatever. From the east, on the other hand, the delegates arrived in force, 270 bishops, at the lowest count, but in fact probably 300 or more, many of them with impressive records of persecution and imprisonment for their faith. The proceedings were opened by Constantine in person, right? And this is again from De Vita Constantini. He quotes Eusebius in De Vita Constantini. When the whole assembly was seated with due dignity, a general silence prevailed, pending the emperor's arrival. First, three of his immediate family entered in order of rank. Then came others, heralding his own approach. Not the soldiers or guards who normally attended him, but friends in the faith. And now, all rising at the signal that indicated the emperor's entrance. At last, he himself proceeded to the midst of the assembly like some heavenly angel of God, right? Because this is Paul here. This is the resurrection of Paul we're talking about, right? That entered the room or what have you. Right. Clothed in a garment which glittered as though radiant with light, reflecting the glow of a purple robe and adorned with the brilliant splendor of gold and precious stones. When he had advanced to the upper end of the seats, he at first remained standing, and when a low chair of wrought gold had been set for him, he waited to sit down with the bishops and had signaled to him to do so. After him, the whole assembly did the same, right? So he waited to sit down until the bishops had signaled him to do so, right? To like defer to the bishops or whatever, when in fact he was taking over the thing. But whatever. Oh, and this is the key thing. It was Constantine who proposed the insertion into the draft statement of belief of the key word that was to settle, at least temporarily, the fate of Arius and his doctrine. This was the word homoousios, meaning consubstantial on or of one substance, to describe the relation of the Son to the Father. Its inclusion in the draft was almost tantamount to a condemnation of Arianism, and it says much for Constantine's powers of persuasion, and it must be suspected of intimidation too, that he was able to secure its acceptance. Many of the bishops of Arian sympathies protested, as might have been expected. Gradually, however, he won them around, pointing out to them that the word was, of course, to be interpreted only in its divine and mystical sense. In other words, that it could mean precisely what they chose it to mean, right? So that's how he lied to the Arian bishops or whatever, the pro-Arian faction. He lied to them, told them, oh no, it doesn't mean anything. It's just, don't worry about it. You can interpret it whichever way you want. Don't worry too much about the semantics. It's just a little detail, right? Right, right. Okay, by the time he had finished, nearly all the pro-Arians, including both bishops Eusebius, had agreed, albeit reluctantly, to sign the final document. Only 17 maintained their opposition, a number that the threat of exile and possible excommunication subsequently reduced to 2, right? So, yeah, the council had delivered its verdict. Arius, with his remaining adherents, was formally condemned. His writings placed under anathema in order to be burnt. So, yeah, so that was the, that was the thing here, when Arius was the resistance of the early church against co-option by the Roman state, Arius was defending the original Christian theology, whatever. And anyhow, or at least the spirit of it, And what happened after the Council of Nicaea? Constantine held a banquet in his palace, right? Not one of the bishops was absent from the imperial banquet, the circumstances of which were splendid beyond description. Detachments of the emperor's personal guard and other troops surrounded the entrance to the palace with drawn swords, and through the midst of them the men of God proceeded without fear into the innermost of the imperial apartments, in which some were the emperor's own companions at table, while others reclined on couches arranged on either side. One might have thought that a picture of Christ's kingdom was thus foreshadowed, and that the scene was less like reality than a dream. Interesting. Yeah, so this was a picture of Christ's kingdom, right? Like the banquet in the imperial palace, right? To reward the bishops for selling the first century congregation or the early church to the Roman state. Anyways, when at least the bishops left, each carried with him a personal present, of course, placed in his hands by the emperor himself. They were, Eusebius tells us, deeply impressed by all that they had seen, just as Constantine had intended them to be, right? So that's what really happened in the Council of Nicaea. See, it was intimate. It was like a thing where, like, first Constantine tried to, in the council, Constantine, his strategy was, he was a shrewd businessman, okay? I grant him that. From a business perspective, he was a good businessman. He was a shrewd businessman. He got what he wanted, right? He was shrewd. He was effective, right? I don't dispute that. But his tactic was very simple. First, try to convince the bishops, right? And do whatever you have to do. Lie if you have to, which he did to the Arian bishops or whatever. That you don't have to worry about. It's just semantics. It's just a little word. It doesn't mean anything. Consubstantial, don't worry about it. Lie. That's one thing. And then when these 14 others said, excuse me, but no, we're not stupid. If you put that in that statement, that means that we are condemned. Then he said, well, then I will, if you don't vote for it, if you continue to be recalcitrant, we will exile you and excommunicate you. We will hand you over to the Persians. Right? And he was like, okay, no, please, no, whatever. No, we agree, right? And then, after he got what he wanted, the council resolution, which said the Trinity doctrine and what have you, and that Jesus is God, or not the Trinity, as the Jehovah's Witnesses point out, it didn't set out the Trinity doctrine, but it set up the framework for it, which is consubstantiality, right? The Council of Constantinople under Theodosius would complete the work, but right. So you can see here, the whole thing was a sham, a setup. The doctrine of the Trinity is a fraud. You know what I mean? A fraud. And the doctrine that Jesus is God is a fraud too. So now in Jehovah's Witness pamphlet, they talk about in the pamphlet again. Should you believe in the Trinity? Right. In the pamphlet, it says. What were the teachings before the Council of Nicaea, right? And they point out to 4 people here. Justin Martyr, who died around 165 EC, said that Jesus, before he existed as a human, had been an angel created by God, but that was not the God that made all things, right? Justin Martyr said that Jesus was inferior to God and never had done anything except what the Creator wanted him to do, right? That was Justin Martyr. Then Irenaeus, who died around 200 EC, said that before living as a human, Jesus had a separate existence to that of God, and that existence was inferior to that of God, right? He maintained that Jesus was not equal to the unique and true God, who was the supreme over all, and that there was no other like him, right? So Irenaeus was monarchian, 100%. I'm an Irenaeus. I would like, yeah. Who do I agree with him? Well, you know what? Well, let's see. Clement of Alexandria, who died around 215 EC, said that before being human, Jesus was a creation, but called God the only true God, uncreated and immortal. Yeah, and he indicated that the Son was after and under the only omnipotent Father, who was not equal to him, right? That's Clement of Alexandria. And then Tertullian, who died around 230 EC, thought the supremacy of God. He made the following observation: the Father is different from the Son because he is greater, because he engenders, because he who engenders is superior to that who is engendered, and he who sends is superior to that who is sent. And he also said there was a time when the Son did not exist. Before all things, God was alone, right? I agree with that God was alone at the beginning. And I believe that now God is alone too, because only he is omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, non-existent creator, supreme observer, etc. And yeah, the non-existent creator stuff was a joke, but developed by an Australian philosopher, but I take it seriously. Anyways, Hippolytus, who died around 235 EC, said that God was one only God, the first and only, the maker and master of all, who had not anything, who was not coexistence with anyone of the same age as him, but that he was one by himself, who by his will called into existence what did not exist before, like Jesus, who was created before he came as human. And finally, Origen, who died around 250 EC, said that the Father and the Son are two substances, two things as far as their essence, and in comparison with the Father, the Son is one light, is one very small light, right? So yeah, that is the the Mormons believe that Jehovah is the name of the pre-existent Jesus. The Mormons believe that Jesus was pre-existent as Emmanuel, right? So yeah. So yeah, the Mormons are actually closer to the teachings that were proliferating in the first century congregation, or like the first 2 centuries, with all these actors: Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Hippolytus, and Origen. The Mormons are sort of like back into that milieu of people who whatever. So in that sense, the Mormons have restored that aspect of Christology. So that's very good of the Mormons to do that. Joseph Smith did a great job, and of course also Charles Taze Russell. Yeah, did a great job too. Yeah. So bring him back. You know, and of course, Michael Servetus in between the Trinitatis Erroribus. He was a brave man, very brave man. I mean, to go around and you know, in the 1500s, to go around saying that you don't believe in the Trinity was a serious thing. You know, it was very, very dangerous. I mean, you were putting your life in danger. And, you know, he was burnt, you know, because that was the concept. I mean, and not only did he go around saying it, he published a book, you know, the Trinitatis Erroribus. I mean, that was like, whatever. I mean, in that era, you know, 1500s, in many places in Europe, it was illegal to not believe in the Trinity. You know what I mean? Or to talk about Arianism or whatever. It was illegal. It was illegal to be Arian. But Michael Servetus was not Arian, but he was Sabellian modalist, but still, you know. Yeah. I mean, the fact that he was anti-Trinitarian already denied that Jesus is God, right? Because the context for saying that Jesus is God is the Trinitarian thing, where the consubstantiality is what confers Jesus the alleged status of a God, which he wasn't. So, whatever. Yeah, but I continue to support the theology, the Christology of Arius, and I am committed to the goal of Christian primitivist restorationism. I am committed to that goal. That has not changed as a result of me leaving Jehovah's Witnesses. You know,